Welcome again, everyone. Let's see. I think what I want to do is do 3 sections. So I'll cover some material and then we'll have a Q&A and then go on to 2 other sections, each of which will have a Q&A. Because part of the idea of this occasion is to try and answer questions. And the first part will be about a mythological perspective on a world gone wrong, because it seems to me we need that kind of deep and ancient perspective in order to see our way through to the next world that's trying to form while this world is collapsing, you could say. And then the second part will be about a psychological perspective, coping in psychological terms. And then the third part will be about art and practice, which I'll explain when I get there. So, starting with a couple of poems. To me, there's always 2 stories going on in the world. The ongoing drama of what we call the world, or the cosmos, or the earth. People refer to it all different ways. And the story of the individual soul. Those are the 2 ongoing stories that are secretly connected, and you could say, in a sense, are more connected in times of upheaval than in other times. And that'll become kind of clear as we go along. So 2 poems to start out with. One about, in a sense, the condition of the world, with the implication that the collapse of things has happened before. Not this way, but it's happened before. So this is an old poem from Rumi. When school and university, when mosque and churches become worn or get torn down, then the dervishes can begin their community. Not until faithfulness turns into betrayal, and betrayal turns into trust, can any human being become part of the truth. Little poem, lots of stuff in there. One idea is that when things are falling apart, a deeper unity is forming somewhere. When the institutions are rattling and becoming hollowed out, one of the old ideas is that the deep self within people is actually rising to the surface, or trying to. And in the poem, he says that's when the dervishes begin their community. Dervishes really a part of the ancient tradition of seeking to find a deeper connection to being, and seeking to find paths of meaning and beauty in the world. And in that sense, we're all dervishes, at least potentially. And so the poem suggests that when things fall apart, there's a deeper unity trying to be found. And that's an important idea. And a matter of fact, to me, it makes living through collapse and confusion much more tolerable and even more understanding. So then the second poem is about the individual and the conditions of things collapsing. And this is William Stafford. There's a thread you follow. It goes amongst things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing, and you have to explain about the thread. It's hard for others to see it, but while you hold it, you cannot become lost. Yes, tragedies happen. People get hurt. People die. And you suffer and grow old. Nothing we can do can stop time's unfolding. Just don't ever let go of the thread. So you have the condition of the world, which right now is a cascade of crises, beginning with climate crisis, which affects everyone and everything in the world. And then more recently, you come into COVID crisis, which affects all the people in the world. Right now, a lot of us are being buffeted by the stories and the images coming from the invasion of Ukraine, which is like a manifestation of the horrors of war. And then if you keep going, you get to the crisis, the humanity crisis, the crisis of refugees, which keeps happening from the climate crisis, from the war, from economic disparity. And if you keep going down, you get to the crisis of meaning and truth, which is critical not in terms of understanding what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, but also the kind of loss of the sense that truth can be found, the loss of trust that's mentioned in the poem, that we have to feel betrayed by the world. It's no longer what we thought or what we hoped for, but that betrayal is partly the process of finding the deeper unity that brings us back to trust while standing on a deeper, wiser ground of being. So that's the overall process. And to me, it really helps to see it mythologically, so that we're suffering through the end of an age and the loss of a worldview. The way people used to view the world no longer explains the world, and it can't retrieve the past. We actually have to find another way of seeing, so that it's not simply a better world that we need, it's also a better worldview that we need. And mythology offers that, particularly in the framework of creation stories, or what I call recreation stories, because there are many stories in which the world falls apart. You get to what seems like the end of the world, and it turns out the end is secretly connected to the beginning. And while one world is collapsing, another is forming unseen below and rising. And because you have the two stories, the story of the world and the story of the individual soul, the individual becomes involved and implicated in witnessing the collapse and possibly contributing to the renewal. And so to me, that's a big mythological idea that doesn't fit with modern science, which thinks that entropy is going to wear it all down. And it doesn't fit with the religious ideas that say that in the end, the world just gets burned up in great fire and brimstone. But the ancient stories, the mythological stories, talk about the end and the recreation. And that mirrors nature. And the mystery of life is also the mystery of nature, which is birth, death, rebirth, or life, death, renewal. That mystery is also what we are in now. We are getting to see before our eyes, in a sense, the depth of a worldview, the collapse of a world that everybody thought they knew, and then the ordeal and struggle of accepting that. But it's helpful, I think, to know that the mystery behind it all is collapse, loss, and then renewal, just as a forest can begin to wear down and the great trees fall down and they begin to decompose into the earth, and out of the earth and out of that decomposition comes the next forest. Doesn't make it less painful. It doesn't make it simply less confusing, but it gives a framework in order to understand what we're going through. And so I noticed we used the title that how to cope with a world gone wrong. And the word cope is interesting, but it has several layers of meaning, one of which is to survive or subsist, to get by, to muddle through, or simply weather the storm. That's one meaning. Another level of its meaning is to come to terms with, to deal with, and to keep one's head above water. So it's like handling the upheaval. And I think both of those things are probably things that we experience at certain times, but in a mythological sense, the way to cope with what's happening in the world is to become an awakened version of one's own self. That the rattling of the world, the upheaval in the world, from the view of the soul is not, it remains undaunted, even in the midst of everything that's going on. The human soul is both ancient and immediate. And from the view of the soul is undaunted. In a way, the soul imagines the trouble in the outside world to be the context for and the instigation for a greater awakening of the individual soul. And the idea is that each soul came to this world in order to live a unique experiment, the aim of which is to become awakened and experience a spiritual fulfillment. So the whole thing looks different from the view of the soul. And coping in that sense has to do with not just subsisting or surviving, but this idea of awakening and coming into a really creative awakening is, I guess, where I'm going to think about it tonight or on this occasion. So what I've been saying lately is, with the conditions of the world getting worse almost all the time, with many things where people can't see how it could possibly work out, then one way to understand that is we're in a collective rite of passage. So that the two things that are trying to change from the inside out involve the awakening of the individual soul, which has meaning in the course of the story of the world, and then on another level, the transformation of collective humanity. So that you could say the way humanity has to cope with the world that's in upheaval, gone wrong, is a radical transformation and an awakening and a deepening of the very sense of humanity. And one way to arrive at that is when we look at all the things that are wrong, all the divisiveness in the world, you look at a symptom and say, what's the symptom aimed at? The symptom of division is aimed at a deeper union. The symptom of chaos, in mythological terms, is the precedent to creation. So let me just say that again. Creation stories are not there to explain the world. That's a kind of a low level of understanding creation myths. Creation myths are there to indicate how the world that we live in is an ongoing creation that we are invited to participate in. Human beings are like the articulators of a possible creation. Or, as ancient people would say, the divine is constantly trying to enter the world and can only enter through the people that are living at a given time. So at the same time, we're suffering the collapse of institutions and the intensification of chaos and confusion. The divine or the eternal, however you want to think about it, the energy from the other world from which this world rose, is trying to enter, and one way it enters is through nature. Nature used to be seen as the green garment of spirit, but the other way it enters is through the individual human soul. And so it's the individual soul that awakens, but when enough souls awaken, then what happens is the collective goes through a transformation. So we need all of humanity to transform, but it can only arise from individual souls. This is the kind of creation mythology that I'm hoping can be helpful in coping with what is not going to resolve very soon. In other words, we're in this dark times, the Kali Yuga, they used to call it in India. We're in it for a while. And so that's another reason to imagine a process that involves transformation, because it isn't going to be fixed with the next election in any country, and it isn't going to suddenly resolve itself. It's the end of an era. It's time turning over. It's a radical transformation of the world and of humans, the place of humanity in it. The middle ground, the ground of uncertainty, tremendous increase of uncertainty in the world, the ground of loss, the ground of disorientation, used to be called the liminal state, or in rite of passage, It's the liminal phase. Liminal means like on the threshold, neither in one place nor the other. And that's part of the anguish of the world right now. And it's part of the source of anxiety. There's a great, and it's been going on for a while, a great increase of collective anxiety. It's one thing to feel anxious if you have a big interview or a test tomorrow. But to feel anxious and not know why, you call that collective anxiety, atmospheric anxiety. And that's very common right now, along with collective fear and so on. So if we just simply feel that it's wrong and we shouldn't be feeling that, it makes it worse because we are feeling that. So judging it a certain way can intensify the effect of it. But when it's imagined as the liminal space from which creation begins again, both in terms of individual life, but also in the big story of the earth, it seems to me it's more understandable, and it becomes easier not just to tolerate, but to support each other in the process of being disoriented, being caught between one thing and another with nothing very clear. If we realize this is the collective rite of passage, then there's the possibility of supporting each other. And there's this old idea of not simply rejecting the so-called negative emotions, but understanding that they are part of a process of learning, of awakening, and of ongoing creation. So I guess what I'm saying is, for those that think that this thing is just going to run its course and it's going to be okay, it's kind of like the war in and on Ukraine right now. They're increasingly saying it looks like it's going to go on for quite a time. There isn't going to be a simple, and there certainly is not a quick solution. It's kind of symptomatic of the whole situation. Climate crisis, the same thing. There is no quick fix. And so that just tells us we're going to have to understand the world differently, and we're going to have to see both the world and our place in it differently. And part of the rite of passage was this old idea that a human being has two sets of eyes: the eyes that open shortly after birth and look at the world as it is or as it is seen, and the inner eyes of the soul that awaken during crisis, that awaken during rites of passage, that awaken during initiation process. There's a seeing from the inside out that values the world differently, that values turmoil and crisis differently, and that can see pathways through that are not visible to the common pair of eyes. So that's part of that ground. And so the context, maybe I'll say one more thing about the mythology. So one of the old questions is, what myth are we in? And when the world is in turmoil, when no one can see how things might end, or people are thinking it's suddenly going to end, that's the myth of apocalypse. Apocalypse doesn't mean fiery end of the world. It's an ancient Greek word, which means, on one hand, lifting of the veil, where everybody sees the oppositions and conflicts that were somewhat hidden. On another level, it means collapse renewal. And so that's just a shorthand for understanding the state that we're in. The idea that it is our mutual fate to be in this together. And so, at least I think, the old stories are helpful in describing what it is and in showing that it is this enduring recreation. Again, it goes against modern positivistic science, and it goes against the typical end-time thinking of monotheistic religions. But it's really the story of the earth, it's the story of nature, it's the story of the cosmos. And so another thing that's going on is a kind of cosmological attempt at relocation. The modern Western world doesn't really have a cosmology, and that's one reason why it seems like the whole thing could just end. From a cosmological point of view, it's like a changing of the gods or something, and it doesn't end at just a certain phase ends and another begins. Um, so to be alive right now means to experience chaos, but also possibly creation. And so, in the midst of what seems potentially overwhelming, I'm going to repeat this idea, the soul tries to grow. And the soul can see connections that the mind can't. Just the way imagination can bring us to places that logic cannot penetrate. And so we need more than one way of viewing the world. And going back to the ancient Greeks again, they had two ways for accounting what happened in the world. And one was logos, from which we get logic, the practical view of what's happening, the accounting for the details of what's happening, and the linear logic to explain certain things. But that logic leaves out many things that cannot be explained, and many of the things that cannot be explained are part of the imaginal world, the world of imagination, that isn't easily explained but can be entered and can be a force of renewal as well as a force of vision for those who open themselves to imagination. And that was the first way of looking at the world: logos, logic, reason, measurement. The second world was mythos, the world of story, the world of imagination, the world of deep feeling. And the ancient cultures, near as I can tell, mostly felt that the deepest power in the human soul, right next to the power of love, was the power of imagination. As a matter of fact, without imagination, you can't really fall in love. And so maybe it's even deeper than love. And so what I'm suggesting is one way of coping is to have a greater imagination of what the big story is. And then we begin to work at where we each individually fit into the story. And Stafford's poem about the thread has the hint that we are each threaded, we are each woven into the great drama of the world. We are each held by, hanging by a thread that is the unique qualities of our individual life. And that's another thing that gets lost in the modern world of generalities and kind of positivistic logic. Each human being is unique. There will never be a person like you existing in the world again. That's the old story of the soul. And the importance of the uniqueness of the soul is the idea that when a person lives out their life, they become like an unusual flower blossoming. They become this unique thing that adds a quality to existence that wouldn't be there otherwise. And that's how each person contributes to the renewal of the world, by bringing the unique essence of the individual life into the drama at the time when everything is critical. Again, the soul is undaunted by the drama. The soul is connected to the deep ancient soul of humanity, which has been through dramas for uncountable numbers of years. And so the soul has a response. And in the case of the individual, it's a unique response. In other words, the value of the individual increases as the crises in the world intensify. And so collective rite of passage to me means that when enough people awaken to their own inner nature and have the courage or possibly the recklessness to really step more deeply into the path that their soul is calling on them to take, what happens is the humans become contributors and even agents of this recreation that's trying to happen secretly, in a sense, in the world. So it seems to me that in the midst of what can be overwhelming, it's really the ego or the little self that's overwhelmed. The soul, or the deep self, if you want to use the psychological term, is actually feeling it as an opportunity to expand. On one hand, we are called upon to contribute more soul to the world. When everything and everyone becomes divided, the diagnosis is that there's a loss of soul in the world. And one of the ways more soul is put into the world is from the individuals who have soul. A person can lose their soul, a person can grow their soul, and a person can contribute soul to the world that desperately needs us. When everything falls apart, the soul knows exactly where to connect. And so I'm arguing, in a sense, for the presence of and the importance of a deep sense of soul, which is secretly connected to the soul of the world. When people have come to the point of abusing and misusing the earth, a loss of soul has happened precisely in the area of the connection of the human soul to the soul of the world. In mythological terms, the world is alive. It's a soul, and it's connected to the individual soul, just the way the individual nature of a person is secretly connected to great nature. Ancient peoples like native tribes in North America would refer to a person's second soul, and the second soul was considered to be the part of them that was specifically connected to a certain kind of bird or a certain kind of tree or a certain area of the forest. And when logic became a little bit obsessive and people decided that there was an object and subject and that they were separated and not secretly connected, people began to lose that soulful connection to nature, nature being the place that's demonstrating constantly the story of birth, death, and rebirth. And so we lost the connection to the mystery, we lost the connection to nature, and humans began to have a diminished sense of nature. And when one's nature or soul is diminished, conflict intensifies. And so then the conflicts that are constantly erupting around the world are symptoms of a unity that is missing but trying to be found. I'm trying to come at different ways of laying out this, what I call mythological perspective. So having been talking about the soul, I should mention the old idea of genius, which is a Latin word that doesn't mean high IQ or special talent. Those things can be part of a genius, but the word genius means the spirit that's already there when a person is born. And that tells us that everyone has some genius. And when everything is falling apart, what's being called upon is each person's genius. Not only that, when things like the institutions are hollowing out and all the things that everybody counted on cannot be counted on, there are gaps and there's an intensification of calling. So in the midst of possibly feeling overwhelmed on one level, there's actually an intensification of the calling to the soul to undertake what they used to call the second adventure of life. The first adventure is just getting a life. The second adventure of life is finding the path the soul would have us take. It's also called the genius path. It's called the spiritual path. It's all of those things. And that calling intensifies, and that, even though it may be challenging in its own way, is a way to settle the soul, a way to feel more grounded, a way to feel meaningful in the midst of the lack of meaning in the outside world, is to be walking the steps of the path that one's soul was intended to go upon to begin with. And that sense of awakening soul, of genius, gifts, and qualities waiting to be found inside the soul, that's where human resiliency comes from. The word resiliency is interesting. It means to spring back up. It implies some falling down has occurred, and then resiliency is a springing back up, but the word doesn't mean to spring back up to where you were. Resiliency, genuine resiliency, means to spring back up at a new place of awakening, so that the resiliency that comes from the deep soul is connected to this idea of awakening and being further on the path that is meaningful for that individual soul. And so I call it radical resiliency, not just the capacity to get knocked down and get up, but to get up with a greater sense of awareness of who I am, to get up with a foot or a step of arrival further on the path that I was intended to go on all along. It's hard to explain that briefly, but the calling, which each person is a receptor for the calling, but the calling is calling to the genius that's inside that knows why we each came to the earth. And I'm suggesting that when the structured world cannot be counted upon, the gaps and the liminal spaces created by the lack of functioning are open spaces for the calling to come through. And what's required is that we're more open to that kind of inspiration, that kind of calling, and more open to seeing the world with different eyes. And then we find much greater capacity for resiliency because we're aligned, in a sense, with the kind of depth of capacity, imagination, spiritual awakening, and giftedness that is the natural inheritance of the soul, which we came here to live out. But when the world isn't in crisis or our lives aren't in crisis, we might just cope by trying to get along, by trying to get by, survive, subsist, or just keep our heads above water. The way the soul copes is by awakening to a greater self-knowledge, to awakening to a greater sense of orientation, by awakening even to an inner capacity that knows how to give to the world. The gifts that we were given naturally are intended to be given consciously. And when we're doing that, then we're contributing to the reimagination, the renewal, and the recreation of the world, which has always been a function of the human soul that has mostly been forgotten, but in the depths of sorrow, loss, and chaos, we're expected to find it again. And so, in that sense, we grow partly by letting go of who we thought we were, what we thought the world was, and what we thought should be happening. There's a great letting go. From another point of view, it's a great stripping down. But when we get stripped down, we don't get stripped down to nothing, even though I know the modern world doesn't understand that there's something deep below the fears and anxieties in a person's psyche, used to be called the soul, so that when we get stripped down on the surface or obvious level, we get closer to the soul. I'm trying to say that the dark times that we are in are part of what would be seen as the chaos that comes after creation, but also before creation. All the old creation stories start in darkness and chaos. Light comes from the dark. Creation comes from the dark. And so when the dark times come, it's not simply the end. It's actually the chaos that on one hand is the end and on the other side is the beginning. And I'm suggesting that as a kind of mythological inoculation in the dark times. So I see that there are questions, so I'll go to questions. Can you think of another time in history of a similar collective rite of passage? I'd have to say no for a couple of reasons. We are in this radical situation where the kind of collapse of ecosystems is happening at the same time as the rattling of human culture. It's really an extreme thing. I don't know of another time that it was as extreme. And the second thing is we're living at a time because of mass communication where everybody knows that there's a global climate crisis. Not everybody, but the overwhelming majority of people. And everybody knows when Russia invades Ukraine, within minutes, most people in the world know something about it. In previous times in history, people were in their local area and there wasn't news coming in from all around the world, or when it was coming, it might take a while to get there. So what's different right now is the global nature of the crisis is evident. And again, I'm saying that indicates our connection to the global solution. And I don't mean that we all agree on something. I'm suggesting something else. That when enough people awaken to who they are in their essence, when enough of us respond to this call to genius, people get to helping recreate things, each in their own direction, without even a need to completely agree. And what happens is, with our threads of genius and our threads of soul, we help reweave those things that have been torn apart. And the evidence of it only becomes available over time. I think that's different than in the past. I think we're in this strange period of global awareness, which unfortunately opens us to global despair, but fortunately puts us in the place of being able to contribute to global healing and global renewal. Can you discuss letting go and how that makes room for something new? Our active part in this process, choosing to let go. Yeah, thank you. So what I was thinking of when I said that was, so the idea is everyone comes into the world with, I call it the soul. In the mythology, you call it soul. In psychology, you can call it the deep self. And so if we look at it psychologically, everyone comes in with a connection to the deep self. And because each person is unique, that deep self manifestation has a variety of gifts and styles and all these things. But it turns out that human families and parents in particular, since most people are not living the full version of their own life, when a child starts showing all these facets and elements, it's overwhelming often to parents, and usually the family has to shut down the possibilities of that young child in order to not feel overwhelmed by the spontaneity of the child, by the multiplicity of the child. And so everyone after childhood is a reduced version of themselves, and there are aspects of ourselves that have been suppressed and repressed and rejected. Orphan qualities, if you want to think about that way. We each have an internal orphan that was never nurtured and cared for. And in stories like fairy tales and some myths, it's that orphan part, it's the rejected part that actually knows what's missing because it's seeing with those other eyes. Although neglected and repressed or suppressed, its inner orphan eyes see into what's missing in the world and also see how its own energy could, when becoming conscious and awakened, it knows where to go and contribute some personal healing and some creative energy. So letting go is really a way, you could also call it the loosening of the ego or the little self. I mean, first we have to have an ego or we just get annihilated. But eventually that which saved us early on will kill us later on. And so we have to let go of some of the attitudes that we had to adopt in order to make it through our own childhood. And then later, we have to let those things go. And I'll come back to that in the psychological second part. How do we hold the grief and the longing, the loss of one world and the yet to be born world with genius? Thank you. Really good question. I mean, that's where we are in a way. We're in grief because we know the world has gone wrong. I mean, I can say right this moment, I'm in grief because all of the stories and the images I see coming out of Ukraine is heartbreaking. The inhumanity of it all, the destruction of it all, the mindlessness of it all, and the inability to simply stop it is heartbreaking, and it causes grief. Absolutely. And I want to make a connection as being asked in the question between grief and longing. So grief, all the emotions have emotion, right? I mean, the word emotion is motion with an E in front of it. So each emotion has its own motion. That's how I understand it. And the motion of grief, as well as sorrow, and the tears that come with it are to wash the psyche and the soul clean. So that grief isn't a state to remain in, it's a state to go through. And the purpose of it is like the letting go, is to wash away whatever is no longer living in ourselves. When someone that we love dies, we grieve and we weep over them because we've lost them from the world that we shared with them. And there are parts of ourselves that we can grieve over. And then what happens is the motion of that grief is to take us down, but also, like sorrow, it has water in it, right? They used to say sorrow is a river and grief is the ocean. And sometimes, like baptism, we need to go through that ocean of grief in order to be washed clean. And once we're washed clean, then something else happens. And a natural longing comes back. Longing meaning our long connection to things that we can imagine that we haven't experienced yet. And so grieving will intensify the longing, and the longing is really the song of the soul trying to find a way to pronounce itself through our body and our life. And so if we allow those kind of cleansing, renewing things to happen in our lives, we can start to see the world as the place of loss and being washed clean and then coming back with, the next beauty of things. The microcosm reflects the macrocosm, back as above, so below. In order to understand how the world might now change, we just have to feel how we ourselves change. And if we allow ourselves to grieve, I've watched the news. I'm a witness. If the world is collapsing and renewing, I feel like I should do both things: witness the collapse and try to find a way to contribute to the renewing. And so I watch the news, and sometimes too much. But sometimes I'm watching it, and then I'm sitting there and I'm going, why is it so blurry? And then there are tears pouring down my face because I feel the grief, because, the soul knows suffering in another person, suffering in another place. We can feel it just the way our soul is connected to the soul of the world. Our soul is connected to the loss. Our soul is connected to the devastations happening in nature and in other people's lives. And it's strange, even though it feels bad and it has pain and it hurts, I let those tears come down, and somehow shortly thereafter, I have more energy. Old idea, the emotions travels in pairs, and grief travels with joy. The descent of grief gives us the possibility not just of longing, but feeling joy again. If we're not feeling joy, something's wrong. We are here partially to be joyous, and often one of the repressed and suppressed and rejected orphan parts of ourselves is the child of joy. And if we're talking about coping, how do we get through this? And I'm adding, how do we come out of this as a bigger, better person? We're going to have to find that child of joy and make space for that child of joy, just the way we make space for the river of sorrow or the ocean of grief. Let's see. How do we stand on the side of enduring recreation when so many are committed to destruction? Well, I would turn that around and say, how do we not stand for recreation, for beauty, for truth, for justice, for whatever it is that moves our soul when others are committed to destruction? The fact that they're doing it is one of those things that we just have to accept, and maybe you pray for them. That's what my mother did. But in the meantime, that behavior is not a detraction. It could be the opposite, be an inspiration or an instigation of our own working for beauty, truth, meaning, and recreation. That's how I see it. It's almost like, people get lost, and actually what they do is lose soul. People lose their souls. And it's not that easy to go fix it for them. But you want to be in good shape if they ever turn around and are looking for help, right? If we haven't grown and healed ourselves, then should they have an awakening or return, we want to be there able to help. All right. So I should go on, Corin?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to go to a poem that many of you might know, beautiful poem, and but it's about, in a sense, it's an answer to that question that I was just trying to answer. Where do we stand when so many people are kind of becoming swept away with hatred and envy and antagonism and even destruction and brutality? How do we find ourselves in a world that keeps going like that? And so this is a poem called Lost. Stand still. The trees and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here. And you must read it and treat it as a powerful stranger. You must ask permission to know it and to be known by it. Listen, the forest breathes, it answers. I have made the place around you. If you leave, you may come back by simply saying, here. I mean, there's a coping thing. Here. And I know when I did it, I bent my knees as if to get closer to the earth, as if to let the energy of the earth rise through my feet as it tries to do. Here. Listen, no two trees are the same to the eyes of the raven. No two branches are the same to the wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, then you are truly lost. So stand still. The forest already knows you and knows where you are. Once you ask permission, you must let it find you. So, Wagner's poem on being lost, beautiful. And it has that idea in it, no two trees are the same, no two ravens or wrens are the same, no two people are the same. When I say that the idea of the uniqueness of the individual has been lost in the world, I mean it. In other words, we have not received the natural support and informing that we are each a unique individual, valuable because of that, imbued with genius and with capacities for awakening, healing, and contributing to creation. Without having that be clear, we are more easily overwhelmed by what other people are doing, by the disturbances caused by people who have lost it all and have no clue to their uniqueness. And so we have to find ways to support our contact to our own unique soul. And there's a poet doing the old job of poetry, telling the truth and showing the secret connections between people and the forest, the birds, and the singing in one's soul. And there's another side to that. I mean, that's the beautiful, quiet, still surround of nature that we are invited to participate in. And then Rumi goes another way when he says, listen, the center leads to love, and the soul opens to creation's core. So hold on to your particular pain, for that too can take you to God. I'll read it again. It's an amazing too. It has mythological ideas in there, psychological ideas, and spiritual information. The center leads to love. The core of the center, love, imagination, I was mentioning at least those two things. And the soul opens to creation's core. That's that secret connection of the soul to the energy of creation. When we create something, make something, and put it in the world that has never been there before, we are imitating the original act of creation. And actually not just imitating it, we are repeating it. And strangely, the pain that we each have is connected to that capacity to love and create. Hold on to your particular pain, for that too can take you to God or the divine or whatever you want to call that tremendous other that is always nearby, And one way to understand that is everybody's gifted and everybody's wounded. And two of the deepest things in the soul are the natural gifts and the present pain. And the pain can lead us to the gifts. And the gifts, when we learn how to live with them, require that we become conscious and find ways to heal the pain. A rite of passage always aims at two things: awakening, greater consciousness, and healing. The two are related just the way gifts and wounds are related. So I wanted to do a psychological piece because coping is often seen as a psychological process. And so this is like maybe psychological coping. And I'm going to lay out this information that I got from Karen Horney, one of the early Freudian psychiatrists and students of the psyche, who wound up disagreeing with Freud on many things, but especially on understanding the nature of children and the child, and particularly the anxiety of the child. So she refers to the basic anxiety that occurs to a child. And one of the reasons I'm interested in this at this time is there's a psychic connection between the intense fears and anxieties that overtake us at this stage of our lives and the way that we survived early life traumas. The way we react, especially to trauma in our lives now, is connected to the way we initially reacted to anxiety. She calls it basic anxiety, fear, and trauma early on. And so this is her theory. To me, it's like a story. So she says the basic anxiety is triggered by parental neglect or even just indifference at a time when the child needs attention. And she says that the first reaction of the child is frustration and anger, kind of a crying out in protest of abandonment when the child is so dependent. And if the parents respond to the kind of angry cry or the aggressive response of the child, then the child has a coping strategy from then on. And according to Horney, those people who have got responded to when they were angry and frustrated and the parents heard the cry and they came, then those people will have that kind of strategy when they feel anxious and fearful later on. If the parents don't respond to this natural expression of aggression, frustration, anger, then the child has no choice but to go to another strategy. And the second coping strategy she calls compliance. It's like complying to the needs and the attitudes of the parents, or complying in such a way as to keep a connection to the source of nourishment and attention. And if that second thing works by doing things that keep pulling the parents closer and keeping connection to whoever's providing nourishment, then that will be the strategy of that person later on, because it's such a deep reaction to basic anxiety. So the first one is anger or aggression. I need you now. Someone comes, I'm going to keep doing that the rest of my life. Second one, they didn't come when I insisted upon it, so now I'm going to figure out how to seduce them. I'll be compliant, and in order to keep getting the attention, the nourishment that I need, especially when I feel anxiety again. And if the second one doesn't work, then the third reaction is withdrawal. Instead of trying to insist that you get the attention and the nourishment, instead of trying to kind of seduce the receiving of that, the child withdraws. And instead of moving towards the parent, the child moves away from the parent and retreats inwardly and secretly tries to become self-sufficient. So she lays them out in this order: anger, aggression, insisting on attention and nourishment. It doesn't work. Then establishing contact by being adaptable and compliant. And if that doesn't work, withdrawal and self-reliance or self-sufficiency. Um, she goes on a little bit and says, the anger strategy is saying something like, if I have power, no one can hurt me. The compliance strategy is saying, if I can make you love me, you will not hurt me. And the withdrawal strategy is saying, if I withdraw, nothing can hurt me. So the suggestion is that we each have some connection to these dynamics, and that what affected us so much as a child gets replayed, both the trauma side and the strategic reaction side later in life. And since the whole world now is like a neglectful parent or a troubled container, whatever you want to call it, people feel more anxiety, and we go to these initial things that are inside us. Another way to see it is, if someone has the anger aggression strategy, then the kind of story inside is, if I make myself big or as big as the world, then I will survive. Whereas the second one says, if I can adjust to the situation and the people around me, then I'll survive. And the withdrawal one says, I must appear smaller than I am to survive in the world. So I'm just trying to suggest these things, that there are psychological kind of patterns that persist in our lives coming from very early trauma. And you can see those same three things happen with animals in nature, that you have fight, submission, or flight. It's the same three things, so it's really kind of a universal thing. So the first thing is to figure out what, if any, of these things I recognize in myself, and realize how that it gets activated as the anxiety and fear of the world keeps increasing. But then it becomes interesting to look at the other two. So just, to comment on the only story I really know, I was the anger aggression child. My aunt told me that I would scream and yell until my mother had to come, seeming apparently somewhat resentfully. But anyway, it kind of worked in the end. And so at the point of feeling anxious, I'll get somewhat aggressive. And in terms of fear, I'm kind of counterphobic. I'll go at the thing I'm afraid of, because that has worked in certain ways. And so, but what that means is I'm less effective, or even less aware of the fact that there are times where I could try to connect and get, now that I'm an adult and not a helpless child, I could get the attention, the nourishment, the affection that I need. And there are other times, I was talking earlier about how I feel like I have to witness, the tragedy of the world. And there are times when I should stop doing that. But if I'm not aware of the strategy of withdrawal, I may just stay in that kind of process of witnessing or paying attention too long. And generally speaking, now in the world, although it can be a fault withdrawing from the world, it also can be the first step to finding real refuge in a world that can be very overwhelming. And so I'm laying that out, and then I want to suggest that one way of coping with the condition in the world right now would be that we have access to all three of those methods. That sometimes we have to have a strategy for standing up for justice, for standing up against injustice, for standing up for ourselves, for drawing boundaries, for being insistent upon being respected if when being disrespected. That we all need that, because the world can run over you right now. And then, of course, we all need more love and affection, and many of us have to find ways not to be simply compliant, but to understand that nature of how to, first of all, say I need help, or I need affection, I need care. Those of us in the anger aggression group sometimes cannot do that. And I'll say also, so those in the withdrawal group sometimes cannot do that. When back in the 60s when I was growing up and we were protesting, we were using our angry, aggressive energy for peace, protesting against war. And in the midst of the intensity of it, there came this whole movement, make love, not war. And it was actually right. It was the second strategy. The first, stand up against injustice. The second, don't go too far because you have to make love, not war at the same time. And they both were meaningful. And then the third one has its place. It's time to withdraw from this intensity that is the presence of the world right now. Not that withdrawal that makes us exaggeratedly self-reliant, but the withdrawal into refuge, into quiet, into still, like in the poem, stand still, the forest will find you. So those are some things to consider in terms of coping strategies and the dynamic of coping, the coping area, that it's a deeply psychological area. And like many, many things, what happened to us early on characterizes how we react to things later on. And so naturally, the crises in a person's life would always bring up these issues of anxiety and fear and bring up the coping strategies and the style of the psyche of the person. But now, the pressure in the world because of this cascade of crises is causing that on a collective level, and it's causing it in individuals when there is no direct crises in their life. We can feel it from the crises on a collective level. So it's time to learn more about those strategies. There are many other ways to do it, many other psychologies. I just happen to like them, those three, because it was so clear and because of the work that she did as a pioneer of the really feminine part of the psyche when Freud was first introducing the latest form of psychology in the Western world. Another way to go at this psychological stuff is the dynamic between the ego, which I like to call the little self, and the deep self. And so one of the core psychological ideas, as far as I'm concerned, is that there is this little self which we shaped when we were pre-verbal and very tiny and dependent on others, that kind of is connected to who we are, but really shaped more as a defense and protection against the enormity, intractability, and possible annihilation in the world. In order to survive, we created this, I would say, temporary ego structure that is, needed. In other words, I'm not in the group that says get rid of your ego, because the ego has the car keys and often has the ashram keys, and so if you get rid of it, you could be really lost. But the idea is to loosen the ego and get the ego to understand there's a deeper self, and there has been all along. And so that deep self, that's what it's called in Jungian psychology, depth psychology in the Western world. In India, for instance, in the ancient practices in India, it would be called the Atman. There's the great self, Brahma, in the world, and then there's the individual representation as above, so below, of that self in the person as the Atman. And so this is a really important idea. In other words, when I catch myself saying to myself sometimes, I can't handle it, I can't handle it. I hear a voice inside, not even me per se, it's a voice inside me saying, I can't handle it. I would come to recognize that's the little self, that's the ego. And it's true, the ego can't handle it. What's going on is too much for any ego, really, except for those, heavily protected kind of egos that want to be in charge of things right now. But everybody else is feeling overwhelmed. But that voice that I can't handle it is the voice of the little self. And so the psychological thing that makes me encouraged is that the little self can learn to recognize the presence of the deeper self And then when things get difficult, the little self can realize, oh, it's time for me to let go a little bit and turn to the deeper self. It's called the first step of the reconnection of the ego structure, the little self, to the deep self within. And so at first it's just a recognition of that. And then as that happens more often, it becomes a development of a relationship between the little self, the personality we present to people in the world, and the deeper self within, which is the thing trying to manifest uniquely and creatively through us into the world. So this, I'll give a little bit of practice here that I learned. So through Mosaic for many, many decades, we've worked with severely at-risk youth who often show up. We convince them to go to a remote camp and have some nature experience, which is also going to be experience of their inner nature. And they arrive in various kinds of conditions of, really severe disorientation, sometimes still on drugs, all kinds of things. And so one of the things we do to get them to really calm down is lay down on the earth. First, they each gather a sizable stone. And, because when you get young people that are in the kind of wildlife or the street life out of there and into nature, at first they're defensive and then they are overwhelmed. They've never been out of the circumstances like that. And it's actually scarier to them than being in the street, for instance. And then they're surrounded by nature, which is really overwhelming if you have never had that experience. And so, but it's also the opportunity to show them, you lay down on the earth. The earth is like the deep self within. Earth energy is the energy of connection. It's the energy of nurturing. It's the energy of support. And so you can actually draw that energy from the earth. We can do that as children, as adults. You lay down if you're feeling overwhelmed and let the earth actually hold you, which it's trying to do all the time. And then I was mentioning before, the energy of the earth can come right through the soles of the feet into the body, or if you're laying down, right through the backbone and into the body. And then we use a stone and put it on the lower, on the abdomen. And we just tell them, breathe down to the stone, breathe down to the belly, breathe. And the next thing, they're in this kind of calm breathing. They have this sense of something deep and meaningful that has weight and presence in the lower part of their abdomen, which is another way of understanding the centering deep self. And the next thing, they're out of that panic stage. And I'm suggesting that we might need to do that more often in the world right now. Lay down. Remember, we're the children of the earth. Let the earth hold us. And sometimes, the weight of a stone. Stones are called slow stories. They're the mineral transmitters of life on earth, and just holding one can be reassuring. A lot of people carry stones in their pockets. It's really a good instinct. But where I was going to was the idea that this deep self within is the origin of our impulse towards individuation. Individuation is Jung's psychological term. It means to be the undivided person. Individuate means to become undivided. Part of the core division that everybody experiences is the division between the little self or the ego self and the deep self. And so the individuated person has faced that division and begun to heal it. What's happening when the world is putting so much pressure on everyone is the separation between the little self and the deep self becomes intensified. And so it's the opportunity to individuate, become more unified, but it begins as a terror or a really inner disturbance. I can't handle it. That's the voice of the little self. As long as we know there's that deeper self, we can begin to recognize again the psychic patterns and shift them. So the self is the deep center. It's also the source of vitality as well as creative energy. So when we can find that connection, however we manage that, and each person has their own style, but each person can do it, we actually have more vital energy, which also alters this thing, I can't handle it, that the little self, that's the mantra of the little self. And of course, walking around thinking I can't handle it causes a drain of vital energy because I can't handle it and it's slipping away. And the connection to the deep self can be a source of revitalizing physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. I'm trying to suggest that this is a time for doing that, and that it's a natural thing to find that. And later on, I'll say something about practice in order to maintain the connections between the little self and the deep self, in order to maintain a kind of a fluid connection to one's own soul. We need practices. That's always been the case. But in the conditions of the world right now, it's even more the case. A practice will help us help us settle, find familiar ground, and orient ourselves. And I'll come back to that later. So another thing about this deep self and the soul, I use the two back and forth. Like I said, soul is like the story word, the mythological word, and deep self is like the psychological term. They're related. But once we get this sense of a presence of the soul, the presence of the deep self, there's a quiet message that we're not alone. And it's also in the poem Lost. Stand still. The trees and the bushes are aware of us. In Aboriginal Australia, they say, Yoro, Yoro. The whole world is standing up and talking to you. Are you speaking back? The idea of existential, isolation that has become part of the philosophy of the West is interesting, but it's not the only idea. There's another way of understanding we are not alone. That is true when we feel the presence of the soul within us. It's true if we have intimations of what it means to have ancestors. It's true if we have a sense of coming from a heritage, not simply because of a literal history, but because we feel called to certain practices and certain things that give us a heritage. One of the ways we get lost, feel overwhelmed by our own anxieties and fears is that we think we are alone. And I think we have to imagine, and again, the world that we're wanting and longing for has to be a world where things are reconnected, human culture to nature, the living world to the living soul of people. And when that happens, we'll know we're not alone. But in order to get there, we might have to start working on it now. And so there are archetypal energies in the soul that are intended to help us deal with certain situations. And there's ways that we can be more aware, like right now, as things are collapsing, the archetype of creation is intensified, and it's actually easier to tap into creative energy in one's own psyche because that archetype is now activated because of the condition of the world. And so I'll do this other poem and then we can go back to questions. So this is Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, talking about, you could call it the deep self or the deep soul, and how it is not placid or accidental. It is aimed at an expansion of the inner life that is unique in its essence, finding a way to express itself in the world. This is his poem. I live my life in growing orbits that move out over the world and over the things of the world. Perhaps I can never achieve the last thing, but that will be my attempt. I am circling around God, around the deep self, around the Atman, around the soul, around whatever we imagine is deep inside us. I'm circling around God, around the ancient tower. And I've been circling for 1,000 years. The soul is an ancient, immediate thing in each person. And I've been circling for 1,000 years, and I still don't know if I am a falcon or a storm or a great song. And according to the coping mechanisms, it's possible that we are all three, a falcon, a storm, and a great song inside one person, trying to find its voice and find its way, its wings, and find its way flying through the storm that is the world right now. I see there's more questions. How do we share our gifts when fear and anxiety is debilitating? Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so that's the tension, though. The tension is between the fear and the anxiety and the being present enough to find ways to give the gifts. I would see it not as one or the other. They're a tension. The soul, there's certain tensions that are the natural tensions of the soul. And so the way I hear that is it's the little self saying I'm too anxious and fearful, and therefore I can't share my gifts. And according to psychology, some of that comes from early on, when we were helpless. Those of us, I assume, gathered this way are not that small and helpless anymore. And so that voice, even though the anxieties and fears are really there, but the voice that says I cannot handle it and therefore I can't give my gifts, that's the voice of the little self, the voice of the ego. So breathing exercises, some way of grounding oneself. What I like about the question is the person knows there's gifts and has the longing to give them, and we have to overvalue that longing and giving side, and we have to kind of step back and realize we're not helpless anymore. There's ways that we can manage the anxieties, through how we treat our bodies, and through being connected to people who are going to support our gifts and therefore help manage our anxieties. I'm a storyteller in public schools in New York and about to set foot in the school for the first time since the pandemic began. While I feel strongly called to the healing power of myth and story, my nervous system is talking to me. We're all having that. I face lots of disrespect in schools and absorb a lot of stressful energy there. I know what you mean. If a person is a teacher now, it better be their path, because it's an intense place to work. And there always seems to be the threat of censoring the deep stuff. What moves can I make as a storyteller to cope in an environment when my body is speaking too loudly? Okay, again, you hear the speaking of the fears and the anxieties, which of course do reside in the body as well as in the psyche. So anyway, thank you for doing that work and even intending to do that work. Imagine what the children need. Young people act the way they act, but what they really need is to see authentic people. And so I don't know how to fully answer that. I want to say this, though. What's mostly missing in the lives of young people, in my experience, is the sense that life is authentic and that people are authentic. They have usually not been treated authentically. Western culture as a whole gives them distractions rather than orientations. And often they don't see people being fully authentic. And it's really difficult in a school system, because you have a system that's set up, usually more oriented to career than calling, usually more oriented to control than awakening, and so on and so forth. So I don't know how you do it. But what I learned in storytelling, especially working with young people, is shortly into any situation, there will be an opportunity to be authentic. And I have tried to take that opportunity. Again, very difficult in a structured school situation. But and this can get you in trouble, so I'm sorry, but I don't know anything else. Let me say this. I would find a story, but really stories find me. A story comes into my mind. Why? Because it's trying to teach me something. I learn directly from stories. If I then bring that story and share it with a bunch of young people, then I'll say to them, where would you be in the story if we had to come and find you? Which part struck you? Some of them will react right away, but sometimes in order to make it authentic, I'll say, here's where I was in that story. In that story, full of anxiety and fear. I was in that place right there. And then what I'm doing is showing them how it affects me, opening the door for them to enter. Your instinct to be a storyteller is genius stuff. And the need for stories is profound. I'm starting this out by talking about how we need stories about recreation or we can't handle the world around us. The kids are in even worse shape. And so my practice when I was doing a lot of work with young people, not often and not in school, I would often work with the kids who didn't fit in school because then I didn't have to deal with the structured part. But anyway, I would tell them stories that have a big problem in it and then ask them, where were you in it? And then and as soon as they start to talk, you're starting to hear their personal story. And then I encourage them to write that down or somehow share that personal story. And soon enough, everybody's talking story, their stories. And all of a sudden, authenticity is penetrating everybody. And the next thing, everybody having what I call sudden community. And then, the school can come along and disrupt it. But for that moment, those young people were connected to themselves authentically, understood they were in a story, and saw someone else who was really willing to take a risk with them and for them. To me, that's a risk worth taking. Can you talk a bit about shadow work and how that plays into transformation and acceptance of our personal genius? Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, the shadow work is part of this psyche, the psychological work. Everyone has their repressed, rejected, I like to call them orphan parts, and everybody has their shadow sides. And right now we see the shadow in a big way in the world. And so let me just go at it that way. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in a way you see one man deciding out of the shadow darkness of his own soul to not just invade, but more or less destroy another country for, what do you want to call that? Some distorted, perverted desire, some longing that has become so twisted that it has to be dominance when really secretly it's a need for love, that kind of thing. And the shadow in one person can destroy a whole population. We're watching it happen. And not only that, it's so hard to stop. And so there's an indication of how shadow operates in the world. It's really profound. And the shadow of authoritarianism is the big shadow in the world right now. It's happening in so many places. And I would say that there's an intensification of the shadow as part of the chaos and the darkness before creation, but also because the world is so intense with all its crises right now, people want false security. And so these very shadow-driven characters claim that they're doing the right thing. Putin says he's removing Nazi people from Ukraine, which aren't in Ukraine, but people accept that because of their own shadow, let's say. So all of our shadows come up. And it's a complicated thing how to work with the shadow, but the shadow is the dark side of the bright part of a person. And so it's somehow related to the bright side. So let me put it this way. As a person becomes more consciously themselves, more able to handle their gifts, which are usually seen as the inner gold, then the shadow of that also appears. So I'm thinking stories because of the previous question. And there's a story that I love to tell about these two children who wind up in the underworld, and what they see. First, there's no one there. Then they see this whole group of people come and stand in the middle of the village, which is like the middle of this psychic village. And then a man comes in and stands in the middle of them. And one side of him is all covered with maggots. And then the people of the village begin to pick all the maggots off the surface of that side of the body of that person. And then the person walks away and the people walk away and it becomes dark, and then the light comes back and the people come back, and then the person comes back again, only this time he's turned the other way, and that side of him is golden, and the people of the village or the people of the psyche take oil and they anoint the golden side and polish it. And so to me, there's a beautiful story about the shadow and the giftedness. And so there are times when we have to realize the ways in which we misuse power or misuse gifts or whatever it is that is characteristic of our life. And then we have to ourselves or get help, therapists, friends, picking off the maggots. And then likewise, to be honest, to be balanced, to be really connected, we then have to recognize what the shining side of us is like. And we have to find ways to polish it, because that's the giving of the gifts. And then we also have to be connected to people who can recognize our giftedness in a genuine way and support us when we're tipping over into the shadow, both by saying, hey, look, you're going into that trouble that you usually get into, or wait a minute, you're forgetting how valuable and gifted a person you are. So for the moment, that's what I want to say about it. I shared William Stafford's The Way It Is poem, the one I read earlier, with my academic institution and was met with rejection, silence, and critique. How do we offer our soul gifts in environments where we are constantly facing adversity and rejection? Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I'm sorry it happened. Good for you. But I notice the reaction I'm having. I'm going into my anger, aggression strategy. I want to tell them all off, you know. Imagine people not realizing the brilliance of that poem. And I'm sorry to say, Bill Stafford, who I was honored to get to work with and get to know, he was not valued in academia very much because his words are simple, and he wasn't wearing the garment that they usually, take the mantle of poetry as the way it's understood right now. He was like a smaller animal handling things that in a really beautiful way. And imagine people couldn't understand the subtlety of that thread. So one of the places that has a big shadow having to do with misuse of power and misunderstanding of poetic inspiration is academia. And so one of the places that has to be reimagined is academia. The word academia, comes from an ancient story. It was the name of a farmer who had this big farm next to the road, and he had a grove of trees where people traveling the road would stop. And along that road came the twin brothers of Helen, who became Helen of Troy. She was the most beautiful woman in the world. And before she wound up in Troy, she was kidnapped by someone, and her two brothers were looking for her. And they were lost and didn't know where to go, but they saw the grove of trees and stopped. And Academus, the farmer, came and offered water and said, where are you going? They said, we don't know. We're trying to find our sister, happens to be the most beautiful woman in the world. And Academus gave them direction, and academia comes from that farm by the road with the grove of trees, and it comes out of that story. And look how far academia has gone from giving people direction how to find lost loved ones and how to find the most beautiful things in the world. So that's a long fight you're in, like the long struggle we're in with all the big issues in the world. Sorry that happened. You mentioned earlier taking refuge from the world. Does it mean following Voltaire's injunction, we must cultivate our own garden? Yes, thank you. Thank you for bringing poetry in and Voltaire. Yes, our own garden, but also the places in nature that are feel like refuge to us. So there's 5 elements in the world, they say, I mean, fire, water, earth, usually the first 3 in all the cosmologies, they're the first 3. The last 2 vary a little bit, but you could say mineral in some form is the 4th one usually. The 5th one in West Africa is called nature. And so the places of refuge often have to do with one of those elements. An example, like when I was a kid, I loved to swim. If we could get to the body of water, I would stay in. I would miss meals. I wouldn't come out of the water. I could be in for hours. And later in life, when I had some losses in my life and I was feeling kind of lost. I had a dream uh, that told me to go back to the water. And so I live on an island in Puget Sound. And so I began swimming in Puget Sound, which is cold water, which turns out to be very healthy. But anyway, that was one of the refuges I found, like a baptism practice by going to the water. When the weather is decent, I'll do it almost every day. And it's swimming that I use, it's good exercise, but it's actually baptism. And that refuge for me, I go in, and this idea of letting go, I let everything go. I let the ocean take it. Let the original sea from which life came take it, and I come back up there almost like baptized. So that's one way to go. But I know people who have to be on a mountain, have to be climbing a mountain because that's a refuge for them. They find some freedom and sense of renewal where other people would not be comfortable. And so we're all refugees, but the refuges can be found in many different ways. And I think they are attuned to the soul. You mentioned the garden. In the United States, they do the survey of everything, but the most popular hobby is gardening. But when I see people gardening, like they're down on their knees, bending over, they look like they're praying. And I think that's actually what's going on. They're praying to that underlying nurturance of the earth, to the spirit of growth and everything. It's a way of returning to the earth, except people don't even know that they're connected to the earth in a kind of metaphysical way. So there are many places of refuge, and each person, I think, is naturally drawn to certain kinds of refuge. And so that's another way to grow the soul, to have more places of refuge that we're each familiar with and know ways to arrive at. All right. So I want to go on to the third part, and I've been mentioning practice. So this is really about art and practice. Old statement. Therapy treats of my condition. Art treats of the condition of the world. So when we're doing art, we're in a way re-entering the process of creation, and we're adding something creative to the world. So that's one idea. But usually when you think of practice, so I want to restate, very hard to keep purpose going, very hard to sustain the connection to the deep self or the soul without a practice. Just counting on accident, it doesn't happen that way. And so the two big paths of practice typically are meditation, contemplation, that's one path, and the other is the creative arts. And I know in the modern world, the creative arts are not always seen as practice. They're seen as careers, and nowadays they're seen as industries, which shows you how far things have fallen. But these are the two directions. One is kind of an inner turn, inner contemplation, meditation, and the other is a move out into the world on the kind of energy of creation. And so the meditative, contemplative style of practice is often associated with spiritual things, which is correct. But the creative arts were also spiritual expressions, the spirit of life coming through people in order to put beauty and things of meaning in the world. And so they're both spiritual paths. Originally, all of the arts were in service of the divine. The arts were used to make temples and to make the areas approaching the temples and so on. Before things got divided and got over distinct from each other, the creative arts were also spiritual practices. You go back and look at the art of the world, and it goes closer and closer back to spirit, back to divine things as you go away from the modern world. So those are the two big paths, and some people are called primarily to one, and some people are called to both, and there are no real rules. The area of practice and growing the soul and deepening the connection to the self, no doctrines as far as I'm concerned, no belief system is fully operative. The unique soul actually manifests itself. And the people that come that we respect or revere because they were a great person at a spiritual practice on the inner path of meditation and contemplation, or on the outer path of creative expression, those that we revere did not follow rules. The most revered people were people who made their own path. And so I'm just saying that because that's the old understanding. And we may start out following someone else's way, that's legitimate. But there are motions and moves of the soul that know precisely where we should go. And there are what I call the pathless path, where you get to the place on the path, whatever the path is, where no footprint is visible or no footprint makes sense. And then we're on the pathless path, and we make our own path to some degree. You can see that with artists, it has to be that way. But the same is true on the more inward contemplative paths as well. So I'm just going to say things about practice because just as another way of opening a territory. And so the first idea that I think has to be said in the Western world when you're thinking of practice is practice does not make perfect, practice makes practice. So one of the real misconceptions in modern life that I see is the idea of perfection. People want to be perfect or do it perfect. The word perfect means through the form. So when it's perfect, it's over. In a sense, it's dead. And so the idea is not perfection. The idea is to be fully part of it, to have it be alive, not perfect. And so in many ancient cultures, if they were making pottery, they would leave one area of the pot unglazed. Or if they were weaving carpets or rugs, they would leave a loose thread, as if to say, we know that we're not perfect. We know that we're not supposed to be. And so practice is not, as the saying would have it, making perfect. Practice makes more practice. The things that are worth practicing are essentially impossible to do. So we get better at them, but we never finish. The practice is like initiation. It's a path that never concludes. And that's why it's a growth path. So just the way I was saying, each soul has its own inclinations towards places of refuge. Each soul has a sense of what practices work. And so it's great to try all kinds of practices, and then there's ones that will make sense. So that's the first part of it, I think. The next part is as our lives change, often our practices have to change. So what makes sense at one point stops making sense. It stops being a place of growth or a place of centering or a place of inspiration, whatever it is. And then it's time to find another part of that practice or another practice altogether. The idea is a person is supposed to really radically change throughout their life. The deep self, the deep soul being the place that wants us to transform and keep transforming. And so naturally, there are times when we would have to find a practice, another level of practice or another style of practice. So I'm just saying that, and that, again, no doctrine, no fixed system, because it's a living soul and it's unique and it has to have permission to find its way. So another thing about practice, so one thing about it is can be a centering, settling place. Because it's connected to the deep self, which is like a deep center. But also a practice will bring up the trauma, the shadow, the unlived parts of our lives. And so whether it's an inner meditative practice, I'm doing the practice, I have some understanding of breathing, relaxing my body, I'm dropping into the center, and oh, wait a minute, there's some stuff that's getting stirred up that has to do with early life trauma, that has to do with something that's wrong in my attitude, that has to do with the shadow thing that I was just manifesting when I thought I was being so spiritual, and so on. And the same thing is true, and even more true, with the creative arts. The energy for the creating is, according to the old traditions, the spirit or something divine coming through us. We're the channel for the expression. As we become a bigger channel, no matter what the practice is, bigger energies, I suggest, coming from the muses, coming from the other world, coming from the divine, pick your story. More of it starts to come through us. As it comes through, it stirs up the traumas that are unfinished. And so, just as I was saying early on, that the rite of passage involves awakening and healing. So anyone who's on the practice path is also on the healing path. That it turns out, part of the adventure of our lives is awakening to who we are and healing all and whatever wounds we carry. And so a good practice will stir them up. And so then you start to realize, when am I doing the practice right? When I'm feeling settled and centered, or when everything is stirred up? And the answer is yes. Both happen. Both are part of it. That idea that the gold and the maggots, the spirit and the shadow, the centering and the trauma, that they're both part of it almost all the time, makes the trauma and the uncertainty in the outside world more tolerable, because we begin to understand it from the inside out. So, all right, a few comments on, further comments on practice. The value of a practice. One thing would be a way to avoid being overwhelmed by a world in upheaval. So a couple of the questions earlier were about being overwhelmed by anxiety of fear in different circumstances. And so one thing I've learned is, when I start to feel that way, like, especially it can come up, like we're talking about bringing stories into school, or talking about trying to give our gift. Well, before doing that, I find a private space, check myself out. I'm doing it now. I move my feet a little bit apart. I bend my knees so I'm not in some rigid thing. I take a breath, and how am I doing? And then I sing. I've learned songs from different cultures that are about, like, an earth song. If I'm feeling anxious, I go right to the practice before I go trying to do something in the world, and I'll begin to sing one of the earth songs, which gives me grounding, centering. I mean, they actually work, strangely. So some kind of practice that is used before I step into the challenging circumstances, which can be, some tension or conflict situation I have to enter. That happens very commonly. People I have to experience where I know it's going to stir some stuff up, taking a bigger risk. So practices that allow us to prepare to deal with something when we know that there's going to be tension, fear, anxiety. So a practice can be a way of anticipating the overwhelm and gathering a deeper sense of self before going into it. So that the second part of that is the constant need to be able to find ways to be at the center and come from the center of myself. And I'm saying it's on both paths, the meditative, contemplative path and the creative arts. Think of someone doing pottery. You sit down, you have a wheel, you have to center yourself in order to center the wheel and allow the pottery to come out of the spinning of things. So the whole thing looks like a centering process, which it is. And so the arts, as well as the meditative practices, have that value of bringing us to the center. The center, as I was mentioning, is the source of vital energy as well as centeredness. the source of quiet as well as inspiration. That's the nature of the deep self. It's the place of quiet and the place where inspiration comes from. The self is complex, and so are practices. Another way to imagine the practice is through the practice I keep finding the gradient of the soul. This is one of the old ideas, that the soul has a gradient line. It's going back to the thread of William Stafford again, like a thread that's pulling us. And when we're close to that thread, we're in a kind of a dynamic alignment that allows us to do things and be less distracted by things on either side because we're aligned with this gradient line, the thread that's trying to pull us towards our own destination. And so a practice is a way to keep finding that gradient line. I'll give another personal example. So I'm a storyteller, and when I'm not on Zoom, I often tell stories by playing drums, African hand drums. And I happen to find that practice, once upon a time, and didn't know that it was connected to storytelling. And then I found the connection between the two. And then I found how I could use the drumming as a centering thing, but I also could use it as a kind of rhythmic pathway on which I could walk the story out into the world. And so I'm saying there's things that can be discovered in finding practices. And again, it's back to the unique person, that we find things in ourselves that come from us into the world through the practices. And many, many things can function as the vehicle of meaningful practice. In my understanding, purpose is something that arises from the deep self, that the sense of purpose in someone's life is already there when they're born into the world, and it needs to be awakened. So that to be purposeful is to be aligned with the center of the self that has this, inherent need to live and express that life. And so when we find a practice, it often aligns us with the purpose. And when we lose our purpose, we can find it by going back to a practice. And all of this I'm trying to just point at becomes more and more necessary as the world becomes more and more disoriented. We have to find our orientation on our own within ourselves. And a practice is a way to do it. Maybe I'll stop there. There's many more things that could be said about practice. I want to say something a little bit about the creative arts, because of how much learning can happen in the creative process. So at the beginning, I was saying that creation is preceded by chaos and darkness. And in a funny way, being creative stirs up darkness and chaos. And so in a spiritual, as it's now called, meditative, contemplative process, the assumption would be that there's disturbance going on, and that's going to now be eliminated through the practice, and we're going to find quietude, centering. Anyway, I'm trying to describe that. On the path of creation, it's almost the other way around. We find whatever it is that we're going to use to be creative with, and we enter it, and it stirs up all kinds of trouble. So that in the common talking about artists and all, people will say, well, they're weird or they're crazy, all that kind of stuff. But what really is happening is, by entering the field of creation, we get also pushed into the field of chaos. How do I say this? To do meaningful art and creation means to suffer through the chaos of one's own self. So the artist is not just supposed to become profoundly good at the art, skillful, and a genius of doing it. The artist is also on a healing path where the process of creating stirs up the traumas and the shadows, and those become part of the process of creating, and healing occurs in the process of making and giving something to the world. I'm trying to expand the idea of the arts. First of all, going back to where the arts were aimed at the divine and actually inspired by the divine. And second of all, that the arts are a healing process as well as a creating process. And so that the issues that come up around being creative or showing our gifts, such as, shame and fear and anxiety, are not antithesis to the process. They are part of the process. And so if we're going to use our creative energies to transform the world, we're going to find ourselves dealing with more of the anxieties, the fears, the envies, and all of the things that we've been told to avoid. Creating order stirs disorder. Being creative involves learning both of those. And so I just want to try that kind of revisioning of art, since art is a major manifestation of human creative energy, and something that we can learn so much from, but not if it's seen as career, seen as industry, or seen as a weird profession, but it's part of the healing path. They used to, I know a lot of musicians, and when I get the chance, I'll say, music is the healing road. It's always been the healing road. And so going back to the beginning, when the world is gone wrong, all these practices become more important, but all these ways of growing soul and deepening the self become more available, more strangely available. And if we're going to envision and help contribute to the next world, which in a sense would have more interconnectedness between humanity and nature, but also more interconnectedness between people of different backgrounds and origins, and so on. All the things missing from this world, we're going to have to find practices that help us learn how to do that interconnectedness and integration inside ourselves. Otherwise, in the places where we think we're going to add creation, we could add confusion. So back to the questions. If linear thinking brings about an end, capital E-N-D, what might a good way to introduce cyclical thinking? What might be a good way? Okay, I don't think it's linear thinking versus cyclical thinking. I think it's, let me just take time as a way of doing that, right? So to be modern is to be trapped in literal linear time, right? Everybody's checking their watches all the time. Everything's on schedule or off schedule. And now everything's timed to the end, right? The word time originally was connected to tide, like the movements of the great oceans, and the tide changes between the darkness of night and the light of the day. Time comes from that. And over time, the sense of time has become smaller and smaller and smaller until it's down to little digital bits that you can't even see. And at the same time, our understanding of the world is that it's wearing down or blowing up and coming to the end of time. And but secretly, time is connected to eternity. The source of time is the eternal. And so I know that we're under pressure, like if you take climate crisis, they're saying we have 8 years in order to turn things around, or else we're headed for, doom again. And there's some truth to that. But if you gave people right now more time, it wouldn't change that. We see the evidence of people not taking the warnings, not taking the heeding. And it's likely to continue that way. So in a sense, it's not more time that we need, it's more eternity that we need. It's more timelessness that we need. We have to allow the timeless and the eternal back into the world, because that's the energy that will change the world. And we have to allow it to come back through us. That's what happens when we have a meaningful practice. Timeless things come through us. And so it's not linear or cyclical. In time, so the Greeks again, they're good at naming things and comparing things and contrasting things. So they had chronos time. Chronos being the god of time and limitations from which we get chronology. Um, and so that was linear time that's always marching on, headed to the end. You're running out of time, the hourglass, all the stuff that people talk about running out of time, the sands of time dropping, that's all Chronos. But they had another time called Kairos, Kairos. Kairos time, when linear time is broken open. Part of what the meditative arts are about, part of what the creative arts are about, is breaking time, breaking it open. And so Kairos is the moment that becomes momentous, is the moment. So when a person is in the midst of deep meditation, there is no linear time. When a person is in the midst of great inspiration, there is no linear time. What happens is the timeless has moved in. When the time comes in, the washing of the person with timelessness is like the water, cleansing everything again. And so, in order to see beyond the world we have been given, in order to have a vision that goes past the limitations that are the time-bound world and the hide-bound world, we need to be in timelessness more. And so I would say the tension is between literal linear time and Kairos time, time broken open, creation time, imagination time, ritual time, art time, all of those things. The time in the depths of the heart is timeless. And so that's my response to that. But that's an important idea about what we do with the limitations of the linear world, because everybody's connected in the world now, through the World Wide Web, but it's horizontal. And so part of what's missing is the timelessness, and part of what's missing is vertical imagination, which gives us the depths of the soul and the heights of the heavens. These things that are part of the inheritance of the human soul are waiting to be refound, and finding them is the antidote to the trap that we're in that's causing all of the anxiety and the fear. Do you have any wisdom for parents, especially parents of young children in this moment? Really good question. I always hesitate to talk with any pretension of wisdom as a parent, and you can check with my kids and see why. Parenting is a very difficult thing to do, and to be a parent now, where the children and the young people are absorbing the uncertainty that's in the world and the disorientation that's in the world. They absorb it, and no one can stop that. And so I guess I do have something to say. First thing is to love them, to just love them in any way that a person can find, to wash them with love. Going back to the coping strategies. It's not that bad parents cause anxiety in children. All parents cause anxiety in children. Karen Horney's idea, it's not abuse necessarily. Indifference is enough for the child to feel on the edge of annihilation. They're so innocent, helpless, and defenseless. And so things go wrong. And so the way to do it is not to try to avoid hurting them. That won't work. The way to do it is to keep loving them and holding them in loving kindness and loving embrace whenever possible, because that can put an impression in their body and in their soul. And so later, yes, the traumas will come back, but they can also feel that they were held, that they were loved, that they were cared for. And especially in the moments when the child acts as themselves. When you see that uniqueness of them that every parent can spot in their child, that's the time to bless them and hold them. And then the other thing as a parent is to help them be in circumstances where they're getting that from other people. The longest history of humanity would include the children being an extended family. And it can happen that parents don't get along with their child. If the child is what the native people in North America call heyoka, or a contrary child, who does everything backwards or opposite than everyone else, that's a hard kid to raise. But it usually turns out that Aunt so-and-so or Uncle so-and-so was like that too. And the extended family, then that child could go and get appreciation, understanding from a different person than the parents. One of the difficulties of being a parent now is usually the parents and the children and the nuclear, and the word nuclear tells you what the problem is going to be, situation. And so that's kind of only, something is missing from the human village for modern children. And maybe as a parent, that's something to be aware of or acknowledge, that we're actually at a disadvantage and we're being asked to do things that are beyond our capacity in some ways. And sometimes that has to be acknowledged to a child when they're old enough, I know I can't give you everything you need, but I love you. And sometimes that combination is helpful. But very hard to be a parent. And I hear from a lot of parents that they have young people that are saying, well, why should I try? The world's going to come to an end anyway. Stories. So let me go there. The other thing, stories. Children, young people need stories. And there are many stories about how the world renews. And I think we all need recreation stories. And so imagine all the people losing everything they have, losing everyone they know, and all kinds of devastation happen in Ukraine. They need stories. They're going to need stories. They're going to have to. Humans turn things into stories. Stories is our way of relating. And so the stories that children hear help them and parent them in a certain way. There are other things that can parent children. How do you bring forth and share the inner genius when the culture is not yet ready to accept it and the institutions are responding to their collapse by becoming more rigid? Really good question. Both of those things are true. So this is the problem. This is the rite of passage thing. That the things that are most meaningful, the awakening to genius, if we're going to use that term for understanding the spirit of the person coming to life, and then the necessity to give from that genius. The gifts that we have in our soul were given to us. God-given is the old phrase. And they're intended to be given. And if that's not happening, something's really wrong. The word talent, meaning a specific gifted capacity, is an old German word for the name of the weight used to measure gold. The gifts of a person are called the gold in the person. And the talent is either the gold being given or it becomes the weight that causes depression. And so when you have a world that is not receiving people's gifts in a humane way, you have like a backup of gifts which become weights on the soul rather than gold qualities to be shared. And so we're in a rough setup. But the whole idea here, in a way, is that is part of what's wrong, and that cannot be the deciding factor. And so I'm going to do the question again. How do you bring it forth when culture seems not ready for it, and when the very institutions that would seemingly be built around education, educare, the Latin word means to bring it out, they're getting rigid in response to the chaos in the world. You just have to find other ways to go. This idea of the next world is a creation project, and we have to create ways to share our gifts, places to give them. We have to create, imagine and fashion new kinds of community that are not dependent on the rigidity of institutions that no longer work. I said at the beginning, it's not just a better world we need, it's a better world view. The institutions that are becoming rigid cannot view a world beyond the one that they are believing in, and therefore they are blocking the roads of imagination, healing, and creation. And so when I said we're in a collective rite of passage, I mean we are already in the middle of a transformation and in the liminal part of it where it's not clear where we go and how we go or where we're going to wind up. What is clear is the places that we are departing from are not working, And that's the case with a lot of the institutions. And so we're kind of ending back where we started, the idea of how difficult this is, and how the circumstances can be overwhelming and they can be discouraging. They are. And yet, it's in those critical contexts that the soul awakens. The soul has ways to find connections that cannot be found by logic. And so I really sympathize with that. The first time I told a story in public, I went to a folklore society. I thought that was the right place to go. And I brought my drum, and I had, at the time it was a Cuban drum. And I told a story from West Africa, but I did it with a rhythm from East Africa on a Cuban drum, with a New York accent and Irish ancestry. I thought it was a good mixture, and the whole place, I was utterly rejected. Someone said, accusingly, is the drum and the rhythm, coherent with the place that it came from? Is it all? And I said, oh no, that's called a Cuban tech head. And I explained the whole thing, and everybody said, you can't do that. They literally said, you can't do it. And I said, no, I just did do it. I just did that. And the point was the story. And what the story is trying to say, and was completely missed by the rigidity, by the misunderstanding, by the desire to name things and nail them down. And so I left there really discouraged, except another part of me was saying, well, I have to go find an audience. I have to go find an audience. And that's what I did. I went looking for, where do I find an audience? And eventually I did find, kinds of audiences. And then I learned more of how to be present and how to let the things come through me. So I understand the problem that's being raised, and it's really part of what brought us together. How do we cope with? How do we create within? How do we recreate ourselves in the world when the world we're in has gone wrong? That is the dilemma. And I just want to repeat. The deep soul is not defeated by that or daunted by it. And the deep self is not saying, I can't handle it. We are not alone, and there are things coming from the spiritual inspirations that try to come through us. There are things coming from nature that are there to encourage and support our understanding of renewal. And the Western existential philosophical idea that we're all alone is like linear time, too restrictive and no longer helpful in terms of it's humanity that's going through the rite of passage. And so thank you for all the questions and all the concerns, and for having trust in my strange sense of coping, which is really closer to creating. And but I think that's really the issue right now. The issues in the world are not going to quiet down. The challenges are not going to become smaller. They're as big as anyone could imagine. But what I'm saying is, the way we deal with it, the way we contribute to the transforming of it, is by not taking the whole thing on. It's not a heroic project. It's a genius project. And that means we just each have to find our thread and our way of being, and then expand that, follow the intuitions and the callings, and the next thing we have found a pathway and a road, and we're on the side of contributing to the healing and the creation. And that's what we were called here to do. So are we close to the end? I'm looking at Corin, who does a whole lot of work and keeps time while I'm indulging in timelessness. All right, so thank you again to everyone for your interest in big subjects, and your desire to to find healing and to find ways to be meaningful. It's partly the longing that gets us there, so let's not lose the longing. All right, and don't let go of the thread, especially if you're in an institution that's becoming rigid. So a last poem then. two things, actually. A last statement from a poet, EQ, a Zen poet, known as the criminal monk, a kind of praise for what he was doing. But he has a line where he says, you can't help but be who you are and where. So if you take each of the questions, and thank you for the questions, and all the questions that weren't, read, and we put ourselves in the question is saying, here I am, and here's who I am and where I am. And so the first step is realizing we can't be anything but who we are and where we are. That's presence, but it's also forgiveness. One of the great practices, forgiving ourselves for all kinds of things, for being who we are and where we are, because that's the only place in which we are here, which according to the poem says, when we accept that, then the animals and the trees and everything gathers around us, and we're not alone because we accepted who we are and where we are. First step, forgiveness, be present to that, and then we move on from there. And so this is a Rumi poem, which is called Madness, Trouble. You say I'm so small, I can barely be seen in all of this. And yet how can this great love, how can this great imagination be inside of me? Friend, look at your eyes. They are small, and yet they see enormous things. Your love of spying far off satisfactions is what keeps you from tasting the real water of where and who you are now. The real way is who and where you already are. And what you search for is sleeping inside your being. That which sleeps and dreams of sweet water is the taste of the divine already inside you. And the true way is who and where you already are. It is sleeping in your very being. That's Rumi. It's the same story. There's something sleeping and trying to awaken in us, which is the essence of who we are, and each of us is a unique being. And when that awakens, it becomes clear, or more clear, where to go. And it becomes clear that we have something to offer. And yes, we are a small, frail being in this great, confused universe. But we can see with the inner eyes of the soul very big things, and we can do our part in contributing healing and meaning and creation so that those big things can become a shared thing in a world that at this point is mostly falling apart. Again, thank you for your interest in these things. Thank you for coming, and good luck. Don't let go of your thread.